The RAF told him he'd never fly again. The doctor said walking was ambitious enough. Maybe a desk job. Maybe a quiet life. Maybe just learn to accept your new reality. But Douglas Bader had a different idea. He strapped 2 metal legs to his stumps, taught himself to walk, then run, then dance, and then he climbed into a Spitfire and proceeded to shoot 22 German planes out of the sky. 22. More than most pilots with 2 functioning legs. But here's where it gets truly insane. When the Nazis finally shot him down, when they captured him and realized who they had, they were so impressed they arranged a ceasefire with the British in the middle of a war so the RAF could airdrop him a replacement leg. Let me say that again. The enemy stopped shooting long enough to help their prisoner get new body parts. Sounds like a movie script, right? It's not. This actually happened. Every word is documented. And the real story, the parts Hollywood left out, those are even wilder. Let's break it down to understand how a legless man became one of the deadliest fighter pilots in history. We need to rewind. Not to the war. Not to the crash. We need to go back to the beginning, to a family and a childhood that would shape one of the most stubborn, aggressive, and absolutely unbreakable men in British history. Douglas Robert Stewart Bader was born on February 21st, 1910, in St. John's Wood, London. His father, Frederick Bader, was a civil engineer who worked extensively in India. His mother, Jessie, was what people of that era politely called distant, cold, Perupe, the kind of upper-class British parent who believed children should be seen and not heard, and preferably not seen too often either. Douglas didn't get hugs. He didn't get warmth. He got expectations, high expectations, and he was expected to meet them without complaint or emotion. His father was away for most of Douglas's early childhood, working on engineering projects across the British Empire. When Frederick finally returned permanently to England, it wasn't for a happy retirement. He came back wounded. He had sustained injuries during World War I, injuries that seemed minor at first, but slowly, relentlessly destroyed his health over the following years. Douglas watched his father deteriorate. He watched a strong man become weak. He watched illness take everything. And in 1922, when Douglas was just 12 years old, Frederick Bader died. The wounds from the Great War had finally claimed him, 8 years after the armistice. Douglas was left with a cold mother, a dead father, and something hardening inside him, something that would define everything that came after. His mother remarried quickly, as was common for widows of her social class. Douglas didn't like his stepfather. His stepfather didn't like Douglas. The boy was too aggressive, too loud, too unwilling to submit to authority. The solution, as it so often was for difficult children of wealthy families, was boarding school. Douglas was sent away, and honestly, it was probably the best thing that could have happened to him. Because at boarding school, Douglas Bader discovered 2 things that would define his entire life. The first thing he discovered was that he was a phenomenal athlete. Cricket, rugby, hockey, boxing, swimming. If it involved physical competition, Douglas dominated. He wasn't just good. He was exceptional. By age 16, he was playing rugby for his school's first team, a position usually reserved for 18-year-olds. He was faster than boys 2 years older, stronger than boys who outweighed him by 20 pounds, and more aggressive than anyone else on the field. His cricket was even more impressive. By 18, he was being scouted for the English national cricket team. Professional scouts came to watch him bat. They saw something special, a combination of natural talent and fierce competitiveness that couldn't be taught. Douglas Bader was destined for greatness. Everyone who saw him knew it. But the second thing he discovered at school was even more important than his athletic ability. He discovered that he absolutely, fundamentally, at the core of his being, refused to lose. This wasn't normal competitiveness. This wasn't the healthy drive to win that most athletes possess. This was something deeper, darker, more absolute. Douglas Bader physically could not accept defeat. He would rather break his own bones than admit someone was better than him. He would rather destroy himself than surrender. His schoolmates remembered him as aggressive, sometimes reckless, a boy who would charge headfirst into situations where caution was obviously required. Teachers called it character. Coaches called it spirit. Modern psychologists might call it something else entirely. They might see trauma responses, might see a boy who watched his father die slowly and decided he would never, ever be weak. They might see someone who learned early that the world doesn't care about your pain, so you'd better not care either. But whatever it was, however you label it, it would serve Douglas Bader well. It would save his life. And it would end the lives of 22 German pilots who made the mistake of thinking a man with no legs couldn't be dangerous. In 1928, Douglas Bader faced a decision that would change everything. He'd been offered a place at Oxford University to study history. His family expected him to become a proper gentleman. Maybe a lawyer. Maybe a civil servant. Maybe something respectable and safe and boring. But Douglas had seen airplanes. And once he saw them, nothing else mattered. The Royal Air Force was recruiting young men for officer training. The pay was terrible. The danger was real. Aircraft in 1928 were barely more than canvas stretched over wooden frames, held together by hope and engine grease. Pilots died regularly. Training accidents claimed dozens of lives every year. The smart move, the safe move, was to take the Oxford scholarship and live a long, comfortable life. Douglas applied to the RAF immediately. His mother was furious. His stepfather was relieved because it meant one less problem in the house. Douglas didn't care about either reaction. In September 1928, at age 18, he entered the Royal Air Force College at Cranwell, the British equivalent of West Point but for pilots. And here's where we see the first real signs of the legend to come. Douglas wasn't just a good pilot. He was a natural. While other cadets struggled with the basics, takeoffs and landings and navigation, Douglas was already pushing limits. He was doing aerobatics when he should have been practicing straight and level flight. He was flying low when regulations said fly high. He was taking risks that made instructors simultaneously furious and impressed. He broke rules constantly, but he was too good for anyone to really punish him. The thing about Douglas Bader was that he could back up his arrogance. If he said he could do something, he could do it. If he said he was the best, he usually was. The normal social mechanisms that humble most people didn't work on him because he actually was as good as he thought he was. By 1930, he had earned his wings and been assigned to number 23 Squadron at RAF Kenley, flying Bristol Bulldogs. The Bulldog was a biplane fighter, open cockpit, single engine, capable of about 175 miles per hour. It was considered one of the best fighters in the world at the time. Douglas loved it. He was 20 years old, flying the most advanced aircraft in British service, and absolutely convinced he was immortal. Let me explain something about the culture of military aviation in the early 1930s, because it's important for understanding what happened next. There were no commercial airlines to speak of. Flying was military, experimental, or completely insane. Often all three at once. The men who flew were a special breed. They were young, usually wealthy because flying was expensive, and convinced that death was something that happened to other people. The RAF actively encouraged a culture of bravado. Low flying was technically forbidden, but everyone did it. Aerobatics over airfields were technically forbidden, but everyone did them. Showing off for girls, buzzing country houses, racing each other through valleys, all forbidden, all done constantly. The attitude was that if you weren't pushing limits, you weren't really a pilot. And the pilots who pushed the hardest were the ones who earned respect. Douglas Bader pushed harder than anyone. He wasn't special in his recklessness. He was just better at it than everyone else. He could do things with an aircraft that other pilots couldn't imagine. Low rolls at altitudes that would have killed anyone with slower reflexes. Inverted flying that lasted longer than anyone thought possible. Maneuvers that seemed to defy physics and definitely defied regulations. By 1931, he was considered one of the best aerobatic pilots in the entire RAF. He'd been selected for the air display team, the public demonstration squad that performed at air shows across Britain. This was elite status, the best of the best. He was 21 years old, at the absolute peak of his abilities, beloved by fellow pilots, admired by superiors despite their frustration with his rule-breaking, and engaged to a woman named Patricia. Life was perfect, and Douglas Bader was about to make the worst decision of his life. The morning of December 14th, 1931, was cold and gray. Typical English winter weather, the kind of damp chill that seeps into your bones. Douglas was at Woodley Aerodrome, near Reading, visiting friend for a local flying club. He'd been showing off all morning, because of course he had. Low passes over the field, rolls at dangerous altitudes, maneuvers that made the flying club members gasp and applaud. Some of them were impressed. Some of them were concerned. A few of the more experienced pilots suggested that maybe, just maybe, Douglas should tone it down a bit. The aircraft he was flying, a Bristol Bulldog, wasn't designed for the kind of abuse he was giving it. The weather wasn't ideal. The altitude was too low for safe aerobatics. Douglas ignored them all. And then someone, one of the flying club members whose name is lost to history, challenged Douglas with a seemingly innocent question. Can you do a low roll? A low roll is exactly what it sounds like. You roll your aircraft while flying close to the ground. It's incredibly dangerous. At low altitude, there's no room for error. If you misjudge by even a few degrees, if your wing dips slightly too far, you're dead. The ground is right there, waiting unforgiving. Douglas knew this. He'd been warned about it. He'd seen other pilots die doing exactly this maneuver. There was absolutely no tactical reason to practice low rolls. They had no combat application. They were pure showmanship, pure ego, pure unnecessary risk. Douglas looked at the challenge. He looked at the aircraft. He looked at the gray winter sky. He did it anyway. At approximately 10:30 a.m., Douglas Bader pushed his Bristol Bulldog into a low roll over Woodley Aerodrome. Something went wrong. The exact cause has been debated for decades. Some say he started the roll too low. Some say the aircraft's engine hiccuped at the critical moment. Some say a gust of wind pushed the wing down at precisely the wrong instant. Whatever the cause, the result was catastrophic. The left wingtip touched the ground. At 120 miles per hour, the aircraft cartwheeled. The wings tore away. The fuselage crumpled. The engine separated from the frame and tumbled across the airfield. The Bristol Bulldog, one of the most advanced fighters in the world, disintegrated into a scattered trail of debris across Woodley Aerodrome. Douglas Bader should have died instantly. By every calculation of physics and probability, he should have been dead. The fuel tank should have exploded on impact. The engine should have crushed him as it tore free. The impact should have pulverized his body. Instead, by some miracle that no one has ever adequately explained, he was thrown clear of the wreckage. He landed on the frozen ground, broken but alive, unconscious but breathing. Witnesses ran to the crash site expecting to find a corpse. They found Douglas Bader, twisted and bloody, but with a pulse. They found him alive. But when they looked at his legs, they stopped celebrating. Both legs were destroyed. There's no gentle way to describe this. The left leg was nearly severed at the knee, held on by strips of flesh and tendon. The right leg was crushed below the knee, the bones splintered into fragments. He was bleeding out onto the frozen ground of Woodley Aerodrome, miles from a proper hospital, with injuries that would have been fatal without immediate intervention. The flying club members did what they could. They applied tourniquets. They tried to stop the bleeding. They called for an ambulance and prayed it would arrive in time. And Douglas, drifting in and out of consciousness, knew something was terribly wrong. He just didn't know how wrong. Douglas was rushed to the Royal Berkshire Hospital in Reading. The surgeons took one look at his legs and made a decision. The right leg was amputated below the knee immediately. There was simply nothing left to save. The bones were destroyed, the tissue was dead, and gangrene would set in within hours if they didn't remove the limb. The left leg they tried to save. For 6 days, they tried everything. They cleaned the wound. They sewed what bones they could. They monitored for infection. They hoped, but the damage was too severe. On December 20th, 1931, 6 days after the crash, they amputated the left leg above the knee. Douglas Bader was 21 years old. He had been one of the most promising pilots in the Royal Air Force. He had been engaged to a beautiful woman. He had been destined for greatness. And now he was lying in a hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, with nothing below his thighs except bandages and emptiness. His flying career was over. His athletic career was over. His life, as he had known it, was over. The doctors came to deliver their prognosis. They were kind. They were professional. They explained that Douglas should prepare for a new reality. Walking with crutches was possible with extensive rehabilitation. A wheelchair was likely for longer distances. A desk job could be arranged. The RAF took care of its own. He would be comfortable. He would be supported. But he would never fly again. Douglas listened to all of this. He heard every word. And somewhere in the middle of the doctor's compassionate, realistic, thoroughly reasonable speech, something crystallized in his mind. In his diary, recovered years later, he wrote a single line about learning he'd lost his legs. Right? Now we'll see. That's it. 4 words. Not despair. Not acceptance. Not grief. Defiance. Pure, stubborn, irrational defiance. The doctors had just told him his life was over, and Douglas Bader's response was to treat that as a challenge. Those 4 words defined the next 50 years of his life. They defined everything that was about to happen. The doctors gave Douglas Bader a realistic assessment of his future. He would spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair. Maybe with extensive therapy and determination, he could learn to use crutches. But walking? Actually walking? Don't get your hopes up. Stairs would be nearly impossible. Dancing was out of the question. Sports were laughable. The best he could hope for was dignified mobility with assistance. They didn't know who they were dealing with. Within weeks of his amputation, while still in the hospital, while his stumps were still healing, Douglas demanded to see his prosthetic options. In 1932, artificial legs were primitive by modern standards. They were heavy, made of metal and leather. They were painful to wear for extended periods. They were designed for standing and basic movement, not actual walking. They were certainly not designed for anything resembling normal life. Douglas looked at them and said, "These will do for now." His rehabilitation began immediately. Against medical advice, against common sense, against every recommendation from the people who actually understood his injuries. Douglas insisted on aggressive, accelerated rehabilitation. His first attempts to walk on the prosthetics were disasters. The metal legs were unforgiving. They didn't bend naturally. They didn't respond to the subtle shifts in weight and balance that walking requires. Douglas fell constantly. His stumps bled from the pressure. The pain was excruciating. Every step felt like walking on knives. The hospital staff begged him to slow down. Take your time. Accept your limitations. Heal properly before pushing so hard. Douglas's response was to demand more practice. Timed out, he approached walking the way he had approached aerobatics, with aggressive, stubborn determination that bordered on self-destruction. If a normal amputee patient practiced walking for an hour a day, Douglas practiced for 4 hours. If a normal patient took weeks to achieve a milestone, Douglas demanded to achieve in days. He didn't care about the pain. He didn't care about the blood. He didn't care about anything except proving the doctors wrong. And within 3 months, he could walk without crutches. Let me repeat that. 3 months after having both legs amputated, a man who doctors said would never walk again was walking independently on artificial limbs. The hospital staff was stunned. His doctors were baffled. This wasn't supposed to be possible. The prosthetics weren't designed for this kind of mobility. The human body wasn't supposed to adapt this quickly. But Douglas Bader didn't care what was supposed to happen. He only cared about what he was going to make happen. Within 6 months, he could dance. Do not shuffle awkwardly. Actually dance. He went to a formal ball with his girlfriend, Thelma. Patricia had broken off their engagement, unable to cope with his injuries, and he danced with her. Waltzes, foxtrots, dances that require balance, rhythm, and coordination. The doctors had set a wheelchair. Douglas was doing the foxtrot, and he was just getting started. Once Douglas could walk reliably, he immediately started pushing further. Driving was his next target. In 1932, cars weren't automatic. They required complex footwork, clutch, brake, accelerator, all operated by feet. Feet that Douglas no longer had. Any reasonable person would have concluded that driving was impossible. Douglas modified his car himself. He designed and installed hand controls for the accelerator. He created special extensions for the pedals that worked with his prosthetic legs. He experimented and adjusted and refined until the system worked. He passed his driving test in 1932 less than a year after losing both legs. Then came golf. Golf is a sport that requires balance, weight transfer, and precise footwork. Every good golf swing starts from the ground up, with the feet providing stability and power. Douglas shot a round of 18 holes in 1933 and scored respectably. Not great, but respectable. Better than many able-bodied golfers. Then came squash. Squash is a sport that requires explosive lateral movement, quick direction changes, and constant footwork. It's exhausting for people with two functioning legs. Douglas played competitively. He wasn't the best player in the club, but he could hold his own against able-bodied opponents. Then came cricket, the sport he had nearly played professionally before the crash. Douglas batted for his local club team. He scored runs. He proved that the athlete he had been wasn't completely gone. Somewhere in all of this, in the golf, in the squash, in the cricket, in the dancing, and the driving, a thought began forming in Douglas Bader's mind. If I can do all of this, if I can walk and run and dance and drive and play sports, why exactly can't I fly? In 1932, Douglas formally applied to return to flying duties with the Royal Air Force. His logic was simple. He could walk. He could function. He had been one of the best pilots in the service before his accident. Why shouldn't he fly again? The response was immediate and final. No. Regulations clearly stated that a pilot must have full use of all limbs. Douglas had no legs. The aircraft he would be flying required rudder pedals. Rudder pedals require feet. Without feet, you couldn't control the rudder. Without rudder control, you couldn't fly safely. Application denied. Case closed. End of discussion, but Douglas wouldn't accept it. He requested a medical examination to prove he could operate aircraft controls. He requested a flying test to demonstrate his abilities. He requested reviews, appeals, reconsiderations, exceptions to policy, and special dispensations. Each time, the answer was the same. No, the RAF wasn't being cruel. They weren't punishing Douglas for his accident. They were being practical. Flying in 1932 was dangerous enough with a fully functioning body. Flying with artificial legs was simply too risky. Too many things could go wrong. The liability was too great. The precedent was too dangerous. Douglas's response was simple and predictable. I'll find a way. He spent hours studying aircraft controls. He analyzed how rudder pedals worked and designed potential modifications. He corresponded with engineers and doctors and anyone who might help him build a case. He proposed alternative control systems. He suggested that his prosthetics could be modified to operate pedals. He refused to take no for an answer. But no was the only answer he got. The RAF had rules. The rules existed for good reasons. And Douglas Bader, despite his heroic recovery, despite his determination, despite everything he had accomplished, was a double amputee. The rules said he couldn't fly. And in 1933, despite all his appeals and protests, Douglas Bader was officially invalid out of the Royal Air Force. His flying career was over. He was 23 years old, with his whole life ahead of him, and he had just lost the only thing he had ever truly loved. From 1933 to 1939, Douglas Bader lived a different life. A quiet life. A normal life. He married Thelma in 1937. She had stood by him through the crash, the amputations, the rehabilitation, the failed attempts to return to flying. She had loved him when he was broken and loved him still as he rebuilt himself. They made a good couple. Douglas got a job at the Asiatic Petroleum Company, which would later become part of Shell Oil. He became an office worker. He wore a suit. He commuted to work. He sat at a desk and shuffled papers and attended meetings. He was by all external measures successful. Good job, good wife, good salary, a nice house in the suburbs. Everything a young man of his class and generation was supposed to want. But inside, he was dying. Everyone who knew him during this period described the same thing. A man going through the motions. The fire was gone. The aggression was gone. The absolute refusal to accept defeat that had defined his entire personality had no outlet. Douglas did his work competently. He came home reliably. He was pleasant to his colleagues and loving to his wife. But the spark was missing. The thing that made Douglas Bader who he was had been extinguished. His legs, the prosthetics he had worked so hard to master, became symbols of his defeat. He could walk on them, dance on them, play golf on them, but he couldn't fly on them. And without flying, none of the rest seemed to matter. Thelma saw what was happening. She watched her husband go through the motions of a life he didn't want. She watched him pretend to be happy in a job he didn't care about. She did her best to support him, to find other sources of meaning and satisfaction. But how do you replace someone's reason for living? How do you fill a void shaped like an airplane? For 6 years, Douglas Bader was trapped. Trapped in a life he didn't choose, in a body he had learned to tolerate, doing work that meant nothing to him. Some people would have made peace with it. Some people would have found new passions, new purposes. Douglas just endured. He waited, though he didn't know what he was waiting for. And then, in September 1939, everything changed. Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939. 2 days later, Britain declared war. The world was about to burn, and Douglas Bader finally had a reason to fight. The day war was declared, Douglas contacted the Royal Air Force. His message was simple and direct. You need pilots. I am a pilot. Let me fly. He expected rejection. He had been rejected so many times before. The rules hadn't changed. His legs hadn't grown back. But this time, the circumstances were different. The RAF in 1939 was desperate. They were anticipating a German air assault that would require every pilot they could find. The Battle of Britain hadn't happened yet, but everyone knew it was coming. And when it came, Britain would need pilots. Lots of pilots. More pilots than they had. Douglas Bader was trained. He was experienced. He had been one of the best before his accident. Yes, he had no legs. Yes, the regulations said he couldn't fly. But regulations could be reconsidered when survival was at stake. And the RAF was beginning to realize that survival was exactly what was at stake. In October 1939, Douglas Bader was recalled to active duty. At age 29, with 2 artificial legs that he had been wearing for 8 years, he was assigned to a refresher course at the Central Flying School. The RAF wanted to see if he could still fly before committing to anything. They expected rust. They expected degradation. They expected that 7 years away from the cockpit, combined with his disability, would have made him a shadow of his former self. His first flight in 7 years was in a training aircraft. Simple maneuvers. Basic controls. See if the legless pilot could even get the plane off the ground safely. He flew perfectly. His second flight was more complex. Aerobatics. Formation flying. Combat manœuvre. The kinds of demanding piloting that separate adequate from excellent. He flew perfectly. His instructors reported that despite 7 years away from the cockpit, despite having no legs, Douglas Bader was one of the best pilots they had ever seen. Not one of the best disabled pilots. One of the best pilots, period. He was cleared for combat duty. And here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Because the thing that everyone assumed would be Douglas's greatest weakness, his disability, turned out to be an unexpected advantage. Let me explain what I mean, because this is one of the most fascinating aspects of his story. Fighter pilots in World War II faced a deadly enemy that had nothing to do with German aircraft. They faced G-forces. When you pull out a dive or make a tight turn in a fighter aircraft, the G-forces push blood away from your brain toward your feet. If enough blood drains from your brain, you lose consciousness. Blacking out in combat means dying. There's no recovery. There's no second chance. You black out. Your plane crashes, you're dead. Pilots dealt with this through various techniques. Special breathing methods, tensing muscles to keep blood in the upper body, G-suits that squeeze the legs and abdomen to prevent blood from pooling, and sheer physical tolerance built up through training. But Douglas Bader had an advantage that nobody anticipated. He had no legs for the blood to drain into. His artificial limbs were metal and leather. No blood vessels. No circulation. No pooling of blood in the lower extremities. During high-G maneuvers, while other pilots were fighting to stay conscious, while they were straining and grunting and seeing gray around the edges of their vision, Douglas felt almost nothing. He could pull tighter turns than other pilots. He could dive steeply. He could push his aircraft harder. The disability that should have ended his career had become a genuine tactical advantage. By February 1940, Douglas was assigned to No. 19 Squadron Flying Spitfires. The Supermarine Spitfire was the most advanced fighter in British service. It was fast. It was maneuverable. It was beautiful. It was the aircraft that would save Britain. Douglas loved it immediately. He loved the power. He loved the responsiveness. He loved the way it felt like an extension of his body, even a body that was partly made of metal. But he wasn't there just to fly. He was there to fight. His first aerial combat came on June 1st, 1940, over Dunkirk. The British Expeditionary Force was trapped on the beaches of France. German forces were closing in. The only hope for the 400,000 soldiers stranded, there was evacuation by sea. And the only thing standing between those soldiers and German bombers was the RAF. Douglas's squadron was scrambled to intercept German aircraft heading for the beaches. What happened next set the tone for his entire war. Douglas engaged a Messerschmitt Bf 109, the Luftwaffe's primary fighter aircraft. The German pilot was experienced. He was skilled. He had 2 functioning legs. None of that mattered. Douglas outmaneuvered him. Got on his tail. Opened fire. The Bf 109 went down. First kill. First confirmation that the Legless pilot could do this for real. Could not just fly but fight. Could not just survive but dominate. But Douglas wasn't satisfied with 1 kill. In the same engagement, he damaged a second Bf 109. When he landed, his squadron mates were stunned. The man with no legs had just outflown the Luftwaffe, and he was only getting started. Summer 1940. The most important air battle in history was about to begin. Germany had conquered France in a lightning campaign that shocked the world. Britain stood alone. The United States was neutral. The Soviet Union was bound by a non-aggression pact with Germany. There was no one coming to help, and the Luftwaffe was coming to destroy. Operation Sea Lion, the German plan to invade Britain, required air superiority. You cannot land troops on beaches if enemy aircraft are bombing your ships. You cannot move armies if enemy fighters are strafing your columns. The RAF had to be destroyed before the invasion could begin. What followed was 3 months of continuous aerial combat. The Battle of Britain. The fate of the free world was decided by a few thousand young men in the skies over England. Douglas Bader was in the thick of it. By July 1940, he had been promoted to command No. 242 Squadron. This wasn't just any squadron. It was a unit of mostly Canadian pilots who had been demoralized by the fall of France. They had been part of the doomed defense of France. They had seen friends die. They had seen the impossible happen as German forces crushed everything in their path. They had retreated across the channel with their tails between their legs, and their confidence was shattered. The RAF needed someone to rebuild this unit, someone to restore their fighting spirit, someone aggressive enough to lead them back into battle. They chose Douglas Bader. His first act as commander tells you everything about the man. The squadron expected a pep talk. They expected sympathy and understanding and perhaps a gentle rebuilding of morale over time. They got something different. Douglas walked in on his artificial legs, which still amazed everyone who saw it, and delivered his opening address. Right? You ought to have been feeling sorry for yourselves. That stops now. We're going to kill Germans. Any questions? No psychology. No motivation seminars. No team-building exercises. Just pure, distilled aggression. The message was clear. We are here to fight. We are here to kill. Everything else is irrelevant. The squadron loved him immediately. Within weeks, No. 242 Squadron was transformed. The demoralized Canadians became one of the most aggressive units in fighter command. They flew every mission they were assigned. They volunteered for additional missions. They followed Douglas into combat with absolute confidence. Because Douglas didn't just give orders. He led from the front. He was always first into the fight. He took the most risks. He demanded excellence, but he demanded more of himself than anyone else. This is the kind of leadership that inspires men to die for you. But Douglas wasn't just a great combat leader. He was also a tactical innovator who challenged the very foundations of RAF fighter doctrine. The RAF in 1940 was still using formations and tactics designed for an earlier era. The standard attack pattern, called fighting area attacks, involved flying in tight, synchronized formations and making carefully choreographed passes at enemy bombers. It looked beautiful in training exercises. It worked reasonably well in theory, and it was absolutely suicidal in actual combat. The problem was that German fighters, the Bf-109s that escorted the bombers, would tear through these neat British formations with devastating effectiveness. The RAF pilots were too focused on maintaining formation to watch for threats. They were too committed to the choreographed attack pattern to react to changing circumstances. And they were dying in droves because of it. Douglas looked at these tactics and said something that, under normal circumstances, would have ended his career. These orders are written by idiots who have never been in combat. Then he ignored them completely. Instead of following doctrine, Douglas developed what became known as the big wing theory. The concept was simple but revolutionary. Instead of sending small groups of fighters to intercept German raids, mass large formations of 60, 70, or even 80 aircraft and hit the Germans with overwhelming force. The traditional approach was elegant and tactical. Douglas's approach was brutal and direct, quantity and aggression, not finesse and maneuvering. The RAF High Command hated this idea. The big wing theory was insubordinate. It was unconventional. It violated the doctrine that had been developed by experienced officers. It also took longer to assemble large formations, which meant the Germans might reach their targets before the big wing could intercept. There were legitimate tactical arguments against it. But Douglas didn't care about legitimate arguments. He cared about killing Germans. And the big wing worked. When a massed formation of British fighters engaged a German raid, the results were catastrophic for the Luftwaffe. Imagine you're a German bomber pilot. You've been told that British resistance is crumbling. You've been told that the RAF is on its last legs. You expect scattered opposition, maybe a handful of fighters trying to interfere with your mission. And then, out of the clouds, comes a wall of aircraft. 60 Spitfires and Hurricanes, diving toward you in a coordinated assault. It's not a dogfight. It's a massacre. The psychological impact was as important as the physical damage. German pilots who survived encounters with the big wing reported feeling overwhelmed, outnumbered, and hopeless. And feeling hopeless is the first step toward losing. Between June 1940 and August 1941, Douglas Bader was in continuous combat. His personal score climbed steadily, kill after kill, German aircraft falling from the sky. The final tally, depending on which record you consult, was somewhere between 20 and 23 confirmed kills, plus several probable kills and numerous damaged aircraft. Let me put this in perspective. The average RAF fighter pilot scored between 0 and 2 kills during the entire war. Many pilots never shot down anything. They flew dozens or hundreds of missions and never once confirmed an enemy aircraft destroyed. Douglas Bader, flying with no legs, destroyed more aircraft than entire squadrons. He did it with a style that terrified the Germans. Douglas didn't believe in caution. He didn't believe in disengaging when outnumbered. He didn't believe in self-preservation as a tactical consideration. His philosophy was simple. Attack. Always attack. If you see the enemy, attack. If you're outnumbered, attack. If you're low on fuel and ammunition, attack anyway and figure it out later. Get close. Closer than doctrine recommended. So close you can see the German pilot's face through his canopy. Then fire. He described his technique in a post-war interview. The closer you get, the harder you hit. I wanted to be so close that I couldn't miss. If that meant taking risks, so be it. He wasn't fighting for survival. He was hunting. Let me give you some specific examples of Douglas Bader in action. August 30th, 1940. Douglas was leading his squadron over the Thames estuary when they encountered a massive German formation. Approximately 100 bombers with more than 50 fighter escorts. The sensible thing to do would have been to call for reinforcements, wait for the big wing to assemble, avoid engagement against such overwhelming odds. Douglas attacked immediately. His 12 aircraft dove into a formation 10 times their size. It shouldn't have worked. By any reasonable calculation, They should have been slaughtered. But Douglas had momentum, surprise, and absolute aggression on his side. In the ensuing chaos, Douglas personally destroyed 2 Bf-110 fighters and damaged a third. When he landed, his aircraft had bullet holes in the fuselage and a damaged rudder. He was furious, not about the damage to his aircraft, about the fact that he hadn't shot down more Germans. September 15, 1940. Battle of Britain Day. This was the climactic battle of the entire campaign. The Luftwaffe threw everything they had at London, every available bomber, every available fighter. The goal was to break the RAF once and for all, to prove that Britain was defenseless, to prepare the way for invasion. Douglas led the big wing that day. Over 60 aircraft under his command, climbing to intercept the largest German raid of the war. What happened next broke the back of the German air offensive. The Luftwaffe expected scatter resistance. They met a coordinated wall of British fighters. The sky over London became a swirling mass of aircraft, gunfire, smoke. Douglas personally claimed 2 kills that day. More importantly, the combined British force shot down 56 German aircraft. After September 15th, the Luftwaffe never recovered its confidence. The invasion of Britain was first postponed, then quietly canceled. The big wing theory had contributed to saving Britain from invasion. And Douglas Bader, the legless pilot who had been told he would never fly again, was one of the architects of victory. By March 1941, with the Battle of Britain won, Douglas was promoted again. He was given command of the Tangmere Wing, a multi-squadron formation that represented some of the best pilots in fighter command. He was now responsible for dozens of pilots and over 100 aircraft. His methods didn't change. He still led from the front. He still attacked aggressively. He still treated caution as a character flaw. And he kept killing. The Germans were starting to learn his name. And more importantly, they were starting to fear it. Luftwaffe intelligence had identified Douglas Bader as a priority target. They knew about the legless ace who seemed impossible to kill. They studied his tactics. They tried to develop counter-strategies. They warned their pilots about the British formation leader who attacked in ways that made no logical sense. One German pilot, captured later in the war, described encountering Douglas's formation. We were trained to expect certain British tactics. This man used none of them. He came straight at us, impossibly close, firing continuously. It was not like fighting an opponent. It was like being attacked by a force of nature. The respect was grudging, but it was real. The legless pilot had become the Luftwaffe's nightmare.
Douglas refused desk jobs. Refused safety. Refused anything that kept him from the cockpit. He was 31 years old, flying combat missions daily, with artificial legs held on bio straps and sheer determination. And 10, on August 9th, 1941, HS log finally ran out, the mission was supposed to be routine. Escort duty over occupied France. Protect bombers heading to attack German targets. Engage any German fighters that try to interfere. Return home. Douglas had done variations of this mission dozens of times. At approximately 11 часов утра, over the Tourne of Lot-UK in northern France, HS formation encountered Messerschmitt Bf-109S. A Dauk figure developed. Aircraft twisted end off and fired in the chaotic bullet that characterized aerial combat. And 10 something happened to Douglas Spitfire. What exactly happened is still debated by historians. The official story is that Douglas was shot down by a German fighter in a enemy engagement. The alternative theory, as reported by some evidence, is that he was the victim of friendly fire hit accidentally by another British aircraft in the confusion of the Dauk frigate. Douglas himself was never sure. It happened too fast that what he knew for certain was this. HS Spitfire took catastrophic damage. The aircraft was spinning. He was going down. There was no saving the plane. The only question was whether he could save himself. Douglas tried to bail out. This is where being legless became a severe liability. Chess artificial legs were pinned under the control column. The forces of the spinning aircraft were pressing him into chess seat. The straps holding chess prosthetics in place were tangled in the wreckage. He was trapped. He was going to ride the aircraft all the way into the ground unless he could free himself. The altimeter was spinning downward. He hit seconds. Maybe less.nz. Moment, Douglas made a decision that saved chess life. He undid the straps holding chess right leg in place. The prosthetic stayed in the cockpit. Chess stump came free. He tried to do the same with the left leg. It wouldn't release. The strap was caught on something. The metal was jammed. The ground was rushing up. He pulled harder. Nothing. He pulled with all chess strength, with the disparity energy of a man who was about to die. And then the leg tore free on its own. Either the strap snapped or the metal gave way under the stress. Douglas tumbled out of the disintegrating Spitfire. He was falling. Spinning. Disoriented. The wind was roaring. The ground was visible below, getting closer. He reached for a chess parachute cord. Found it. Pulled. The canopy deployed with a violent jerk. He was no longer falling. He was drifting. Slowly descending toward occupied France with one artificial leg. The left leg, which had torn free, was damaged. The right leg was somewhere in the wreckage of chess Spitfire, probably miles away. He was alive. But he was in enemy territory. And he could barely walk. Douglas landed in a field near the village of Bleringham, in German-occupied France. Chess remaining prosthetic leg, the damaged left one, was barely functional. The mechanism that allowed the knee to bend was broken. He could stand on it, barely, but walking was nearly impossible. Within minutes, German soldiers arrived. Douglas Bader, the legendary Legless ace, was now a prisoner of war. The Germans were initially confused. They had captured a British pilot. That was normal, that happened regularly. But this pilot had no legs. The soldiers weren't sure what to do. They had heard rumors about there being the legless British pilot who was destroying their squadrons. Was this him? The uniform confirmed it. The identification papers confirmed it. The attitude definitely confirmed it. Even captured, even wounded, even missing a leg, Douglas Bader was arrogant, aggressive, and completely unintimidated.